And thank you for this much awaited moment, and for all of you for being here today to listen to my presentation on the Americans in Florence. And thank you, Rashima, for your wonderful, kind, and comprehensive introduction. A special thank you is for the news that inspired the topic of this talk, Mrs. Nancy Truehold, who is here with her husband Bob Truehold, our mayor of Quogue. Nancy expressed to me a great interest in exploring the history of the American cultural presence in the life of Florence. This lecture will be given in September at the Episcopal Church of St. James in Florence as part of a tribute to the American community there. I remember visiting this church while attending the classical school Liceo Michelangelo in Florence, where the professor of theology regularly gave the assignment to all students to visit different places of worship present in the city, and then define the common grounds. I was struck by the elegant architecture and the overall beauty of the Church of St. James. The church was built in 1907 by the Americans who had come to Florence and became a church, a community center, an American social network, and a cultural bridge between Florence and the United States. Today it remains a community of Americans who contribute daily to the cultural life of the city, and there are also communities of English-speaking parishioners, people from other countries also. I wish to thank my husband John for his ongoing support of all my cultural endeavors that underscore the immense appreciation for the mutual cultures in our lives. And I thank my son Mark and daughter Ashley for being with us today here, and one son trying to fly into town. I must express my heartfelt gratitude for Michael Martin, who is here today, and he will present with me his tireless work behind the scenes every time, assisting me in researching and bringing these spectacular visuals to life on the screen. Both Michael and I are a persistent example of my European educated mind combined with his innovative and creative American mind that together have made this and all of my previous presentations a reality. Again, Europe and America came together. I hope you all enjoyed the beautiful prelude highlighting the American explorers who were drawn to the Renaissance art in Florence. Their journey and the way they brought that beauty back home to reinterpret it into our own unique culture is exactly what we are here to appreciate together today. For Americans of the 19th century, Florence was not merely a destination on the Grand Tour. The Grand Tour, as we know, was created by the English aristocracy who wanted to send their children to continental Europe to learn about classical culture. And Italy became the focus, and Florence was the most sought-after destination. It was a place where inherited assumptions about art, about religion, about history, and even identity were tested against the weight of centuries. What emerged from these encounters was a distinctly American way of seeing Renaissance art, shaped by experience rather than by distance. In fact, Florence was often imagined by Americans as distant, if nothing else geographically, monumental, and almost untouchable, but still calling them like a magnet. A crucial shift happened to American audiences once they settled into the city and they became a part of an enlightened circle of ideas. Quickly, Renaissance art was seen as no longer distant or untouchable, but one belonging to a living culture, one that could be entered, experienced, and one that could even be participated in. For these pilgrims, Florence became a city of contemporary meaning and historical grandeur. It was a setting where art, politics, and daily life coexisted. Americans changed their perceptions from a distant admiration to a lived experience, from unquestioned reverence to critical engagement, and the historical artifacts became an active influence. These Americans represent the beginnings of how Florence became a catalyst for cultural change in the United States. There is something about Florence that invites transformation. It began by connecting with British writers writing in the English language. Americans had recently cut the umbilical cord from Great Britain, however, English remained their language. Prominent among all was Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who had great cultural influence in English-speaking circles that reshaped the American perception of Florence in profoundly different ways. Elizabeth and her husband, Robert Browning, were English intellectuals and writers who eloped, literally eloped, against the wishes of the families, eloped to Florence from England and became an integral part of the life of the city. Settling a castle Whitby in the center of the city facing the Arno River, in the 1840s, the Brownings became deeply embedded in Florentine life during the period of political upheaval and cultural renewal. These are the decades of Italian Risorgimento, the Italian insurrections, to free up the nation from foreign domination, which heated up revolt, strong sentiment expressed in parades and military action. Their contribution, the Barrett Browning contribution, to the American perception of Renaissance art was essential. Through the Brownings, American readers encountered Florence as a living environment shaped by human experience. Renaissance art in this frame was no longer frozen in time, it was part of an ongoing cultural continuum. In one of Elizabeth's poems, Aurora Lake, Florence is no longer only a place to be observed, it becomes the origin of artistic identity itself, the ground from which visions begin. Aurora Lake is not about Elizabeth Barrett Browning's life, but it is her artistic self, a reimagined figure through whom Florence becomes the origin of vision itself. Let us examine a verse from her poem, Aurora Lake.
The artist's part is both to be and do, transfixing with a special central power the flat experience of the common man, and turning it to poetry.
As Elizabeth writes, the artist's part is both to be and do, a principle embodied by those Americans who came to Florence, to live within it, to question it, and ultimately transform Florence, while they themselves are transformed by it. I read many of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poems in college, particularly the sonnet from the Portuguese, which were not from the Portuguese. They were her love poems to her husband that she didn't want her family to interpret as such back in England. As a Florentine, I found much of her work so captivating to see how my own hometown was described so beautifully, and I will share with you my favorite excerpt from Aurora Lake.
Beautiful, the city lay along the ample vale, cathedral, tower and palace, piazza and street, the river trailing like a silver cord through all and curling loosely, both before and after, over the whole stretch of land sown whitely up and down its opposite slopes, with farms and villas.
Following this poetic but real and suave image of Florence, many inspired Americans headed for Florence to experience their rebirth. One of those Americans was a Boston native and Harvard-educated artist, Horatio Greenough. He became the first American sculptor to earn international fame after moving to Florence in 1825. Horatio Greenough is one of the first Americans to train extensively in Italy. He brought neoclassical principles rooted in Renaissance study back to the United States, influencing early American public sculpture. His colossal statue of George Washington, commissioned by Congress in 1832 and now in the Smithsonian American Art Museum, portrayed the founding father bare-chested and draped in a classical toga, resembling the ancient statue of Olympian Zeus. While this deeply shocked the conservative American public who preferred contemporary clothing, it demonstrated to Europeans that American artists were well versed in the philosophical and aesthetical ideals of the Renaissance and of antiquity. They had got there. Greenough believed that young America needed an artistic vocabulary grounded in classical standards from ancient Greek and Roman masterpieces to gain recognition on the global stage. Following the admiration for great classical sculpture, another artist, Hiram Powers, moved to Florence in 1837. He was drawn to Florence by its highly skilled Italian stone carvers and the abundance of pristine Carrara marble from the Apuane Alps. This is not snow, it is marble. He had been inspired by Renaissance sculpture and by Canova's neoclassical work. In his own Fisher Boy, he showed remarkable skill before he went to Florence. Once in Florence, he built a studio there, specifically because it gave him prestige and credibility, and he operated there for most of his life, and is in fact buried in Florence, in the American Cemetery. Once established in Florence, he demonstrated his sculptural prowess in Il Tempted in 1842, and again in his most famous piece called The Greek Slave in 1843. Powers achieved international acclaim partly by creating several versions of the sculpture for several different patrons of his own. With multiple versions, the statues could tour in exhibitions spreading their fame faster than previously possible, and through his production workflow, he enabled America to acquire monumental art. Museums could expand their collections, and even middle and upper class Americans could encounter these neoclassical pieces widely. The Greek Slave at once gave him a place among the leading sculptors of his time, and it attracted more than 100,000 viewers. It was used in abolitionist causes and was found in union supporting state houses. He sculpted his most famous piece, The Greek Slave, 6 times, each slightly different. All of them are on display and can be seen at various museums across the country, as noted on the screen. His success demonstrated that Americans could learn from Renaissance traditions, and through him, the art production in Florence was transformed into a proto-industrial enterprise expanding across the Atlantic. Walking a similar path of self-discovery, Thomas Ball witnessed firsthand how Florence functioned almost like an artistic ecosystem. Born in Massachusetts in 1819, he was educated as a portrait artist, a painter, and a musician. In the 1850s, he traveled to Florence, joined the growing colony of Anglo-American artists there, where he discovered his passion for sculpture. Thomas Ball absorbed Renaissance balance, classical anatomy, monumentality, and idealized form in his own sculptures like the equestrian statue titled George Washington. This masterpiece is on display in the Boston Public Garden and carries the imprint of Florence intrigue. Boston, heroic composition and calm emotional restraint, almost a direct inspiration from the Medici rulers who immortalized their heroes mounted on horseback, like the equestrian monument of Cosimo I de' Medici in Piazza Signoria. Thomas Ball recognized and benefited from this new transatlantic art pipeline. American designed works, Italian craftsmen helped execute them, and finished sculptures were shipped back across the Atlantic. The system mattered enormously in that it created a channel through which Florence shaped American public art. It did just that for his Emancipation Memorial, which is still standing in Lincoln Park in Washington, D.C., where it was unveiled on April 14, 1876, exactly 11 years after Abraham Lincoln's assassination. At the time, Americans viewed it as a powerful symbol of emancipation and unification after the Civil War. This cultural intersection demonstrated how Florence helped shape the way America memorialized their emancipation. Along with the artists who operated along the guidelines of classical and Renaissance art, are collectors who based themselves in Florence to promote new commercial endeavors. One of the first was Charles Loeser, the Italian name Carlo Loeser, who contributed to the preservation and appreciation of Renaissance art, and later, also after the Renaissance, he was a collector of several centuries of Florentine art. He was linking American patronage with European cultural heritage. Loeser restored and transformed Villa Torri Gattaia into a collector's home, an intellectual salon, artistic environment known for Renaissance artworks, carefully curated interiors, rare books, handcrafted furniture, and a humanistic atmosphere. Loeser helped introduce an idea that Renaissance living was less about owning objects and more about cultivating an entire aesthetic life. Loeser became a bridge between Renaissance Florence and the modern Anglo-American artistic reform movement, which was very strong in the United States at the time. In his will, Loeser donated his entire collection of Tuscan art from the 14th to the 16th century to the city of Florence. It is exhibited on the second floor of Palazzo Vecchio, City Hall, in the apartments of Eleonora di Toledo, the wife of Cosimo de' Medici I. Loeser left Florence a physical reconstruction of a collector's world. Walking through the mezzanine today is perhaps the closest surviving experience to stepping into the home of an American expatriate scholar who devoted his life to Florence and to Renaissance art. Charles Loeser was not alone in this interpretation of how Florentine art changed his entire appreciation of life. Early Italian Renaissance artists also conquer James Jackson Jarvis, who played a crucial intellectual role by introducing that era to Americans. His writings and collections helped expand American understanding beyond the High Renaissance to earlier artistic developments. In the early 1800s, Americans were familiar with and admired artists like Raphael and Michelangelo. Of course, the art of grand classical perfection, while earlier Renaissance paintings were at times dismissed as being primitive, unsophisticated, and awkward. But Jarvis changed those perspectives. He was fascinated and profoundly moved by artists like Giotto, Fra Angelico, Cimabue, for whom the perfection of art presented and included an emotional, spiritual, and sincere set of elements of humanity. His collection of pre-Renaissance paintings by early Florentine masters chose to focus on spiritual expressiveness, confronting everyday struggles and spiritual awakenings. In his own writings, he explains how to look at these paintings and why they matter as expression of human development. James Jackson Jarvis brought the intellectual perspective of these early artists back to America, creating the groundwork for American collectors, curators, scholars, and wealthy patrons to understand why the Renaissance, from beginning to end, represents the achievements of an entire civilization. Yale University began purchasing from his collection in 1871 as Americans were starting to appreciate earlier Renaissance art. Yale acquired the entire collection after Jarvis' death in 1888, where it continues to be admired and studied. Well, taken together, these figures reshaped how Americans understood Renaissance art. They moved perception from distant admiration to lived experience, from unquestioned reverence to critical engagement, and from historical artifact to active influence. Florence became a catalyst for cultural transformation through great art. A crucial American figure who embodied that experience was Nathaniel Hawthorne. Born in Salem, Massachusetts, at age 59, near the end of his life, he died at 64, and during his Italian travels in 1858 to 59, Hawthorne engaged deeply with Florence's artistic and religious landscape. His novel, The Marble Faun, 1860, set largely in Rome and in Florence, reflects a sustained confrontation with Renaissance art and with Catholic culture. Hawthorne's reaction was more than simple admiration, it was inquiry. He wrestled with the sensual beauty of Renaissance art and Protestant moral restraint. He focused on the relationship between aesthetic perfection and spiritual ambiguity, and the weight of history embedded in objects and spaces. For American audiences, Hawthorne reframed Renaissance art as something that demanded interpretation versus simply passive appreciation. He introduced a critical dimension. Art could be beautiful and morally complex. It could inspire and unsettle. In The Marble Faun, Hawthorne turns the classical sculpture into a moral metaphor, suggesting that Renaissance art is to be interpreted. Its beauty is inseparable from the human question it evokes. From The Marble Faun.
The mind grows conscious that beauty here is not separate from history, but bound to it.
Well, this was a significant shift. Renaissance art was no longer simply the pinnacle of achievement. It became a subject of intellectual and ethical engagement. Through Hawthorne's writings, he demonstrates his restraint for embracing the art simply for the beauty it reveals, as he says in the marble font.
The beautiful may be a snare and lead us astray.
He understands that for many Americans, including himself, this beauty can also be a source of uncomfortable, immoral, and sinful expressions and thoughts, as he said in his Italian notebooks.
The nude shocks our northern sense of modesty.
Hawthorne's words genuinely caught the attention of Americans who had never seen art that could depict such passion. The marble font became so well loved that people took it with them to serve as a travel guide during their pilgrimage to Florence and to Rome. An entire market of photographs erupted to allow tourists to purchase photographs of the art and the architecture that Hawthorne described in his book. People would bind the images into the pages, creating an extra illustrated personal edition. I have personally seen these books many times in private homes, in flea markets, and antique dealer shops in Florence. The urge to visit Florence became very strong with Hawthorne's words. People wanted to see these treasures for themselves. Where Hawthorne questioned, John Singer Sargent absorbed and extended. Born in Florence, and I know that not many people know that John Singer Sargent was born in Florence, to American parents who had moved to Florence in 1856. Sargent represents a generational turning point. He did not encounter the Renaissance as a foreign inheritance. He grew up within its visual environment. He went to school there, and he completed his formal artistic training in Paris, where he worked at 18 years of age at the Académie des Beaux-Arts, the Academy of Fine Arts. The building is a replica of a neoclassical building from ancient Rome, actually, and the interior of the building for the students to learn is a collection of Renaissance Italian art everywhere, and at the end presided by a perfect rendition of the Last Judgment from the Sistine Chapel in Rome. That's where he continued his learning, and he brought with him the structural clarity and the compositional discipline of Renaissance art as foundational elements to his work. His portraits demonstrate anatomical precision rooted in classical tradition, a mastery of light and texture reminiscent of Venetian painters, like the Renaissance painters Tintoretto, Tiziano, Veronese, combined with the synthesis of Renaissance structure with modern immediacy. John Singer Sargent astonished American and European audiences because he combined the technical skills of the old masters with an immediacy that felt unmistakably modern. His paintings are characterized by confident, fluid brushwork, brilliant handling of light, extraordinary rendering of fabrics and textures, and an uncanny ability to capture personality and presence. Up close, many of his portraits appear almost sketchmanic, with broad, energetic strokes. From a distance, however, they resolve into remarkably lifelike images. Americans were particularly impressed by his ability to portray wealth, status, and sophistication without stiffness, giving his subject a sense of vitality and psychological depth. What impressed viewers most was that Sargent seemed to make a century of artistic tradition look effortless, proving the Renaissance principles were not relics of the past, but living tools, ready to be used and capable of expressing the modern world. Through John Singer Sargent, American audiences could see that the Renaissance was something that was continuing on, that could be adapted and made modern, as he did. A contemporary American to John Singer Sargent wholeheartedly interpreted the spirit of European, especially Italian aesthetics for American audiences was Edith Wharton, a native New Yorker who moved to Europe at a very early age with her parents. Edith returned to live in the old continent with her husband after their marriage. From then on, three interests came to dominate Wharton's life: American houses, writing, and Italy. She spent her entire adult life focusing on architecture, gardens, and society, with an emphasis on Renaissance principles, which she translated into a language accessible to American cultural life. In contrast to traditional Victorian style brought over from England, Wharton transformed American society by bringing the proportions, the balance, and the classical aesthetics of Florentine culture to her novels. Her writing described architecture and artistic environments with historical and classic continuity. In 1921, The Age of Innocence propelled her to become the first woman to receive the Pulitzer Prize for fiction writing. I am sure many of us know the 1993 movie made with outstanding actors like Daniel Day-Lewis, Michelle Pfeiffer, and Winona Ryder, and exceptional photography and interiors and costumes. I would now like to indulge all of us with a clip from the movie The Age of Innocence, directed by Martin Scorsese.
The occasion was a solemn one, but the Countess Olenska arrived rather late, signaling a carelessness of which she was entirely unaware. She entered without haste or embarrassment the drawing room in which New York's most chosen company was somewhat awfully assembled.
Ah, Countess Olenska.
Good evening. We're delighted you're here.
The Duke of St. Austria, may I present Countess Olenska?
The Trevenna George II plate was out. So was the Van der Luyden stock from the East India Company and the Dagonet Crown Derby. Dining with the Van der Luydens was at best no light matter. Dining there with a duke who was their cousin was almost a religious solemnity. When the Van der Luydens chose, they knew how to give a lesson. It was not the custom in New York drawing rooms for a lady to get up and walk away from one gentleman in order to seek the company of another. But the Countess did not observe this rule.
I want you to talk to me about May.
You knew the Duke before?
From Nice. We used to see him every winter. He's very fond of gambling and used to come to our house a great deal. He likes to wear the same suit every evening. He thinks it brings him luck. I think he's the dullest man I ever met.
Overall, Edith's writings had a profound effect to examine their own society with the same critical eye reserved to European culture and Renaissance Florence. We saw China from Ginori, Cellini, like Silverware, etc., in this little clip. Edith Wharton represents the moment when the influence of the world of Florence examined at large, moved beyond art and entered the broader realm of American cultural consciousness. Edith Wharton, through Florence, brought Florence into America as a de facto standard. To the age of innocence, she showed Americans that beauty, culture, and historical memory were not luxuries, but essential elements of a civilized life. What happens when Americans no longer just experience Florence, but begin to define it for themselves? And that is what described the path followed by Berta Berenson, whose encounter with Florence became the pinnacle of his intellectual pilgrimage by settling at Villa Itati in the early 20th century. Berenson developed a method of connoisseurship that would profoundly influence how Renaissance art was understood, especially in the United States. His work focused on attribution. Who painted what? Quality, the sublime craftsmanship of the artist, and tactile values. How convincingly a painting conveys physical presence, a concept learned from William James, a philosopher he highly admired. William James taught that the meaning of a work of art lies not simply in what it represents, but in the living experience it creates within the viewer. Berenson found that such meaning centered on the painter's ability to create such convincing forms that the viewer feels the solidity, the weight, the volume, the texture, and the physical presence of the objects depicted, until the painting stimulates an imaginative sense of a structured reality. Berenson found that great Florentine masters, especially Giotto and later Masaccio, excelled at this. Their figures seem substantial and real. We almost feel their bodies occupying space. He contrasted this with painters whose works lacked the same sense of physical presence. The idea was part of a larger theory that he expressed in his writings on Renaissance art. Berenson believed that great art enhances life because it intensifies our awareness of reality. Tactile values, as he called them, were one of the chief means by which painting achieved this effect. He often paired them with movement values, the ability of a painting to suggest energy, action, and life. He thought that Botticelli had just that in his painting of Springtime of Flora across the meadows. A painting's power to transform visual impressions into an imagined experience of physical reality is a quality he regarded as one of the defining achievements of Florentine Renaissance art. And for many of us, that stands as a great truth. His true impact extended far beyond scholarship. Berenson advised major American collectors, figures whose purchases would form the foundations of museum collections in cities like Boston and New York. Through this relationship, he helped determine which Renaissance artists would be celebrated, which works would enter American collections, and how the Renaissance would be presented to the public. In effect, Berenson transformed Florence into a center of interpretive authority and ensured that American institutions would reflect that interpretation. Florence appealed to Berenson because it embodied qualities he believed were the highest achievements of civilization: individualism, humanism, learning, beauty, and intellectual freedom. In many ways, he saw Florence as the birthplace of the modern human spirit. After the death of Bernard Berenson in 1959, his beloved home Villa Itati passed to Harvard University in accordance with his wishes. Today, it serves as Harvard Center for Italian Renaissance Studies, one of the world's foremost research institutions dedicated to Renaissance history, art, literature, music, philosophy, and culture. Each year, it hosts an international think tank of fellows, professors, and graduate researchers who live and work on the estate, making use of Baronson's extraordinary research library of more than 140,000 volumes, the renowned photo archive, and his exceptional collection of Renaissance painting, sculpture, manuscripts, and decorative arts. More than 60 years after Baronson's death, Villa Itati remains a vibrant, intellectual community where his belief that Renaissance art should be studied in the cultural landscape that produced it continues to inspire new generations of scholars, ensuring that Florence remains a living classroom for understanding one of history's greatest artistic achievements. Around this central figure stood a broader network of Americans whose work reinforced and expanded their evolution and their evolving perceptions. This is a merger of perspectives and culture that continue to nurture all aspects of Florentine life as of today. It is a merger based on very fertile ground. Florence does not give the same gift to everyone, and Florence in turn received the gift of an empowered, admiring, younger culture. To Americans, Florence gave a way to understand that great art, which is given perennial fame, is not distant or confined to museums or to history. It is something that reaches across the oceans, that calls people forward and, if they're willing, changes them. As someone who grew up in Florence, as I did, I have been greatly touched by the lives of such gifted Americans who came to live in Florence. I followed the same profound attraction for America, leading me across the ocean to the shores of where I live and where I am right now. In my experience of living in both worlds, I witnessed the evolution of my personality, which was steadily transformed by the attraction of this duality of cultures. I felt the call to share these binary paths, to merge into a new vision. In other words, in my life, it has become impossible to divide one perspective from the other, since the mind and the soul have come to embrace this combined view of the world. The American students who now come to the 90+ university programs for them in Florence express their admiration and desire to learn from the past. For me, and for the ones who grew up with me in Florence, learning from the future became the mission, an attraction to the American world, which modeled the future of who we, Florentines, would become from our platform of an established history. Also, while America is celebrating his 250th birthday, the month of July, Florence pays homage to a friendship between our two worlds as well. You will find articles, events, and various festivities throughout the city. In the gardens of the Villa Bardini Museum from July 2nd to October 18th, we have time to go, there is an exhibition called Florence and the US, the story of a friendship. The walking paths throughout the gardens are embellished with photos that acknowledge the storied 250 years between us. The display coincides with the Firenze 50s, 60s, 70s exhibition at Villa Bardini, showcasing 100 additional photographs from the historical archives of the renowned Florentine photography house, photo locking. Our presentation has been an enthusiastic tribute to the American Pilgrims for Beauty, perhaps part one, as there are many, many more until our day, and we could probably have a follow to this. The Pilgrims of Beauty whom we have highlighted today, and it's also an homage to the 250th anniversary of the United States. Our story began with Americans crossing the Atlantic in search of beauty. However, by the 20th century, they had maintained beautiful villas, established schools, libraries, and also built their own church, the Church of St. James. Many of the Americans who came to live in Florence also chose to be buried there. A special cemetery called Cimitero Evangelico agli Allori, commonly referred to as the Allori Cemetery. Allori is the laurel tree, and there is a variety of laurel trees and bushes in this particular cemetery. Created as a Protestant cemetery and later evolved to incorporate other faiths. In fact, 4 of our pilgrims are buried there: Thomas Ball, Hiram Powers, and Carlo Charles Leuser. What began as a pilgrimage for beauty had become a permanent cultural bridge between America and Florence. Happy 250th birthday, America, and to everyone here, thank you very much for joining us today. A special applause for Michael Martin.